Deniz is professor of German here at UC Berkeley. She earned her Doctor of Philosophy at Freie Universität Berlin with a dissertation on literary and cinematic imaginations of America in early 20th century German culture. She has also worked as a certified translator of Turkish for law courts, hospitals, and publishers for several years. Deniz Gokturk has written numerous articles on migration, culture, and cinema, some of which I will highlight. She is co-editor of the German Cinema Book with Tim Bergfelder and Erica Carter, published by the British Film Institute in 2002. She is also co-editor of the source book, German in Transit, Nation and Migration, with David Gramling and Anton Case, which was published by University of California Press in 2007. There's also a German version of this. Together with Levent Soysal and Itek Tureli, she published Orienting Istanbul, Cultural Capital of Europe. And as a translator from Turkish into German, she has co-edited an anthology of contemporary Turkish literature with Zafer Zenocek and translated novels by Aras Eren and Bilge Karasu. Deniz Gokturk is co-founder of the electronic journal Transit, launched by the German department here in 2005. And since 2021, she has been, she co-launched the ongoing Archives of Migration series, which has brought German language writers and artists to present their work to an American audience. Finally, Deniz Gokturk's monograph, Framing Migration, 7 Takes on Movement and Borders, is forthcoming. And today, we look forward to hearing Deniz Gokturk present on tracing complicity through personal archives and machine learning on the art of border trouble. Thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for the introduction, and also thanks to Debarati, Rhiannon, Victoria, and Cathy, entire team for creating this convivial space for us here at CC in the container and assembling us to engage with this timely topic of borders and crossings. And also for indulging me to show this film in the middle of the conference. So I want to structure my talk around this piece. So the call for papers for this conference raised the question: what are the possibilities and limits of humanitarian and human rights discourses on migration and refugees? So a question on my mind is, can moving images and more generally the arts expose the violent effects of border regimes, or are they inevitably complicit in patterns of visual exploitation, not least through entanglements in funding structures of the art world? And in the following, I will try to argue that we need to combine the humanistic focus on portraits and personal narratives of migrants and refugees, which aim to elicit empathy for the pain of others, with some attempts at more systemic vision. And one such example for an artistic intervention that transcends objectifying migrantology, I'm borrowing this term from cultural anthropologist Regina Rundhild, would be this video that we just watched, Triple Chaser, 2019 by Forensic Architecture. Some of you know their work very well, so I'm looking forward to discussing it with you. So I picked this piece because it foregrounds reflection on questions of agency, purpose, and participation in processes of image production. So I first saw this video in Istanbul last year in November, and I'm going to say a little more about that location a bit later. At this point, let me just preface the whole thing by saying that I decided to tackle material that is relatively new to me for this talk. I know next to nothing about the technicalities of AI and machine learning. So I'm hoping that you will help me think through the questions that this video raises. As far as I can tell, looking at forensic architecture's kind of extensive work, this piece stands out as quite unique in the archive of worthy investigations conducted by the group under the directorship of A.L. Weitzman. Not least because it's self-reflexive, ironic, even funny, despite the very sinister evidence of violence that it presents. So before we look in more detail at this video, just up here, before we look. Before we look in more detail at this video as an aesthetic object, as well as a political intervention, let's cover some background in broad strokes. So Elizabeth already told us about investigations of the research agency Forensic Architecture based at Goldsmiths at the University of London. Their investigations have tended to focus on gathering documents, crowdsourcing evidence, reconstructing timelines, and determining responsibility with regard to specific incidents of human rights violations on a global scale. And we have a map here to show the extent. So on their website, I found this interesting etymological definition of forensis. The Latin adjective forensis originally meant pertaining to the forum. The forum was a busy place, among other things, a market, a meeting place, the place where the court convened. So this idea of forensics in the commons, or also as Tom Keenan has called it, counter-forensics, conducted publicly in art spaces and law courts, relies on new possibilities of research and communication enabled by digital tools. And I'm quoting the website again, techniques in spatial and architectural analysis, open source investigation, digital modeling, and immersive technologies, as well as documentary research, situated interviews, and academic collaboration. One such investigation was commissioned by the People's Tribunal, unraveling the NSU complex, to investigate the murder of 21-year-old Halil Yozgat in his family's internet shop in Kassel, a murder that was later revealed to be a connected series of racially motivated murders carried out by the National Socialist Underground, NSU, a far-right German terrorist group that operated between 2000 and 2011, committing 10 murders, all but one citizen with non-German backgrounds, 2 bomb attacks, and numerous robberies all across the country. Forensic Architecture's investigation, titled 77 square meters, 926 minutes, involved the reconstruction and reenactment of the crime scene, designing a digital model of the internet shop and also building a full-scale replica of the shop, which was then exhibited at the House of World Cultures in Berlin and at the famous art show Documenta 14 in 2017 in Kassel, the city where the murder had actually been committed. So the reconstruction and reenactment proved that a secret police intelligence agent had been present in the shop at the time when the shooting occurred, although he later claimed not to have noticed anything. Adopting methods of forensic investigation to offer evidence which calls into question blind spots of institutional racism, the group presented its results in the sphere of art. In our era of post-truth and alternative facts, art seems to take on a new role in complicating common conceptions of reality and creating truth. A brand new investigation by forensic architecture on the fire that blazed the overcrowded Moira refugee camp on the island of Lesbos in September 2020 was just published 4 days ago on March 6th on their website, presenting a reconstructed timeline of the outbreak of the fire based on eyewitness reporting, cell phone footage, mapping, 3D simulation, which proved that the fire had been a disaster waiting to happen due to the overcrowded conditions in the camp, and the 6 migrants who were convicted of arson merely served as scapegoats. So now I didn't show pictures of these works, but you can find them on the website easily. So, but now let's turn to the film we actually watched, the 10-minute, 35-second video, Triple Chaser, co-produced with Laura Poitras's Praxis Films, which presents an investigation in 5 parts. In the introductory part 1, the occasion for investigation is flagged as the deployment of tear gas by US border guards at the Tijuana-San Diego border on November 25th, 2018, shown in raw documentary footage. And this was an incident that was written about extensively in the press also. As we learned from the voiceover, narrated with cool understatement by David Byrne, the tear gas was produced by the Safariland Group, owned by Warren B. Kanders, who was also the vice chair of the board of trustees of the Whitney Museum, which commissioned this piece. The participation of forensic architecture in the exhibition at the Whitney is thus flagged as the second occasion for this investigation. Tear gas at the border, and then the Whitney biennial. By setting up this cycle in the first 2 sentences, the work proposes to turn the investigation around to reflect on structures that enable the production and consumption of art. It is important to note here, of course, that the video was not produced in cooperation with the Whitney Biennial, and forensic architecture ultimately withdrew from participation in the biennial, like other artists did. Nonetheless, the piece makes a point of revealing, showcasing that investigative forensic art itself is implicated in a system of patronage, circulation, and interdependence that is not untainted, but actually benefits directly or indirectly from the international trade in arms and the increasing militarization of civic spaces and borders. The use of tear gas as a chemical weapon in warfare is actually banned, as we know, and as the video states, but it is widely used by states to suppress protests. As forensic architecture states on their website, because of the classification of tear gas as a non-lethal munition, there is little documentation from manufacturers regarding sales and export, meaning that accountability activists regularly track, sale, and use by finding photographic documentation of canisters in footage from protests. So now in part 2 of the video, the voiceover elaborates the methodology of the investigation. The video produced in 2017 actually predates image and text creation by artificial intelligence. So to be clear, this has nothing to do with the generative AI of DALL-E or GPT-3, which is currently all over the news, and we're all worrying whether our students will submit essays written by the bot. So this is an earlier phase of AI. The supervised machine learning employed here is object recognition by a classifier, which was the first breakthrough for AI around 2012. And the training for object recognition is based on a large data set of images which show these tear gas grenades. So after the training with selected uploaded images, the AI becomes capable of recognizing objects also in unknown new images. As stated in the voiceover, a large number of sample images are needed were needed at the time for this machine learning process. Since only about 100 open source documentary images were available, forensic architecture then decided to produce synthetic images. As we learned from a technical paper published on their website, they reached out to activists to collect images of triple chaser grenade, which breaks into 3 parts when it's fired, hence the name, so triple chaser. They collected these images through the open source OSS platforms GitHub and Discord, and processed them with a tool called media triage or mtriage. Based on these images, they produced a digital model of the grenades by using 3D software. Trained on thousands of synthetic images, the AI learned to recognize the designated objects in documentary footage. So this is the process that is also explicated in the video itself. This production of synthetic images raises interesting questions about the relationship of documentary and fiction. Such synthetic data is being used increasingly, suggesting that AI modeling is not based on objects in the world, but on imagined worlds. So welcome to the world of simulation. So the narration then returns to Warren B. Kanders, reporting that in 2016, he gave 2.5 million to the Aspen Music Festival, and the festival renamed the Sunday concert series in his honor, the inaugural evening of which began with a performance of Richard Strauss' Vier letzte Lieder, 4 last songs, composed for soprano and orchestra in 1948, when the composer was 84 years old. These are his last works. They were posthumously bundled as a cycle. We can see the first song is called Frühling, Spring, with a text by Hermann Hesse, which was actually performed by René Fleming at Aspen in 2016. And it's included in its entirety in Triple Chaser. And I'm now going to show you the text. So I consider the inclusion of Richard Strauss's reflection on presence and transience in the middle part 3 of Triple Chaser, a stroke of genius. So preceded by a seizure warning, the music is set to a throbbing dance of color-masked grenades, grenade images sampled from the synthetic data set against fancy, colorful backgrounds. And lasting for almost 3 minutes. It's like a music video, this flamboyant celebration of what is effectively a piece of trash, of waste, is the longest part, forms the longest part of this video. And the lyrics of the song, which I myself had to look up on Google, of course, serve as a highly ironic commentary on the theme of air and tear gas, dusky, blue skies, fragrance. And then in the middle stanza in particular, it provides a brilliant commentary on the bright colored grenade images we see on the screen. Nun liegst du erschlossen in Gleis und Zier, von Licht übergossen, wie ein Wunder vor mir. So the translation is by the bot. Now you lie open in brilliance and splendor, bathed in light, like a miracle before me. And the last stanza then epitomizes absorption, that desire, absorption, implication. Du kennest mich wieder, du lockest mich zart, es zittert durch all meine Glieder, deine selige Gegenwart. You recognize me again. This line reads like a direct nod to the image recognition process, thanks to Elizabeth before this point. You gently beckon me, your blessed present rivers through all my limbs. The bot is actually not bad at translating, I have to say. So the play with figure and ground, color and form in this pop art spectacle draws the viewer right into this aesthetic experience. After all, the show was exhibited in an art museum. The voiceover sets in again, speaking about the synthetic data training set and the symptoms caused by exposure to tear gas. By the mere fact of our spectatorship and visual pleasure, we are all complicit, even as we produce or consume art that appears to be critical of the status quo and the system of governance. And this point, I think, resonates in some ways with Michael Rothberg's analysis of the implicated subject as an analytical category that allows us to think beyond victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. So Think Triple Chaser probes the system and conditions of seeing that make the interdependence between aesthetic pleasure and international ammunition deals possible and acceptable. So in part 4, the video then takes us back to raw cell phone footage of exposure to tear gas. So experienced by members of the team, one of them at the Gezi Park protests. While we see footage of the city turned into a war zone, the voiceover mentions that 130,000 tear gas grenades were fired across Turkey during these protests. A Turkish reporter on biber gazı, pepper gas, points out that 2015, so 2 years later, 1.5 million tear gas grenades were purchased by the Turkish government. This report also, This report also offers some history, tracing the first use of tear gas back to World War I. And it's later, and then documents later uses against citizens, among them also on the Berkeley campus in the 60s, 68, I think. So the line here is also interesting. Halk düşman askerinden tehlikeli. So the people are then considered more dangerous than enemy soldiers. A weapon that isn't used on enemy soldiers is actually used on the people. So beyond the and here. So this was the Whitney exhibition, and here beyond the Whitney, Triple Chaser has been shown in multiple exhibitions around the world, including Kunstwerke Berlin. And as I mentioned, I first saw it in Istanbul in November 2022 at the tail end of the Istanbul Biennial in an exhibition titled Hayat, Ölüm, Aşk ve Adalet, Life, Death, Love and Justice, in the art gallery of the Yapı Kredi Bank in Galatasaray. So this gallery actually is a mere 10-minute walk from Taksim Square, the place that made international headline news in summer 2013 during the Gezi Park protests. The last big civic uprising against the increasingly autocratic government in Turkey, which was beaten down by a massive police force. So seeing forensic architecture's video in this location was a significant and timely reminder of those events, which had also unleashed a great deal of creative potential in civic resistance. Here's one image that you might remember, the standing man. And lots of also creativity on social media at the time. So forensic architecture's systemic investigation thus connects the Tijuana border to Taksim Square and continues on to expand the scope of vision to a more international scale, assembling in simultaneous gallery view evidence of use of tear gas from the US, Turkey, Peru, Iraq, Israel, Palestine, Yemen, Bahrain, Tunisia, Guyana, Venezuela, Egypt, and Canada. So it becomes a more kind of global picture and take on this topic. And part 5 then zooms back in, or takes us back to a specific site, the scene of border trouble, this time not at the Tijuana border, but at the border between Israel and Gaza, where the Israeli army is firing a different kind of ammunition, Sierra bullets, also produced by a company owned by Warren B. Candace. And we learned that civilian protesters were killed and wounded by these missiles. So, and the video then ends with a document. The European Center for Constitutional Human Rights served a warning to Sierra bullets. So a document pointing to an inconclusive, ongoing legal battle. We know that subsequently Warren B. Candace resigned from the Board of Trustees of the Whitney, but he still continues to sell ammunition around the world. So where do we go from this acknowledgement of complicity, implication, and responsibility? The highly ironic intermedial self-reflection about the production and effective appeal of image and sound proposed in the middle part of this video puts us on the spot as consumers of art. The mediatized synthetic images that we are viewing are far removed from representational realism or documentary impracticality, foregrounding fabrication and design. The visual pleasure that they induce has a destabilizing and disorienting effect, also with regard to the viewer's stance towards documentary footage included in other parts of the video. So how do we relate to the pain of others, to quote Susan Sontag's famous essay, as we view images of violence, can documentary images really offer evidence? How do context and commentary come into play? So with this ironic middle part, Triple Chaser pinpoints the predicament of art, serving a desire for captivating images and sounds, while also claiming social relevance. As viewers in the gallery space or in front of the monitor at our desk, we maintain a safe distance from the struggles on the street or at the border. As we are watching, we cannot smell the fragrance of the tear gas. We do not feel the bullets in our flesh. As it turns out, we might even be implicated in the creation of militarized borders, war zones, and death worlds, to use Achille Mbembe's term, as complicit participants in a cycle of consumption that connects philanthropic sponsorship of the arts with international arms deals. So again, speaking with Mbembe, there is no outside anymore. The latency of genocidal structures is right amidst modern political thought and the nation-state governance. And in his critique of abstract universalism as a force of separation and closure, echoing Hannah Arendt, of course, who was already evoked this morning by Tom, Mbembe urges us to focus instead on opening and crossing the utopia of a borderless world, the need for reciprocal care, civic participation, and collective organizing in the light of our shared humanity. So how are we doing for time? Okay, we're good. Okay. Speaking of death worlds, you know, I cannot avoid doing a little aside detour, thinking about the current situation in southeastern Turkey and northern Syria. So the massive earthquakes that hit the border region, so since it's also a border region, it is somewhat relevant. So the massive earthquakes that hit the border region of Turkey and Syria were a stark reminder that human existence on our planet is volatile. In the early morning hours of February 6, 2 earthquakes of 7.8 and 7.6 magnitude wiped out entire cities and buried people in their sleep under rubble, killing a confirmed count of over 50,000 people, with many more still unidentified, and leaving millions homeless. So once again, we've been watching shocking images of unimaginable destruction and stories of terrible pain at a distance. An earthquake knows no borders. So this is reminiscent of Ulrich Beck's concept of risk society, a concept that found its epitome in the uncontainable fallout of the Chernobyl disaster. The earthquake was a natural disaster, but it is also clear that much destruction and death could have been avoided with better governance, specifically enforcement of building codes in this region, which is well known to be at high risk of earthquakes. After the earthquake, reports revealed that contractors had erected 12-floor apartment blocks where feasibility assessment by civil engineers had permitted 4 floors. Civil servants and politicians had authorized such irresponsible building activity. So better disaster preparedness and coordinated response might also have saved lives and prevented much suffering. This negligence calls for another forensic investigation on a massive scale. On the Turkish side of the border, the earthquake exposed deficiency in responsible governance. So it's worth remembering that according to the UNHCR, following the migration control deal that the EU struck, that the European Union struck with Turkey in March 2016, Turkey is now home to the world's largest refugee population of some 4 million. In the earthquake zone on the Turkish side, 11.6% of the population consisted of Syrians under temporary protection. So while residents were hit by the earthquake irrespective of their nationality, according to statements released by refugee rights organizations, subsequent relief and support efforts discriminated against Syrians, for example, barring them from entering shelters or receiving aid. So if the autocratic nation state fell short of protecting its citizens, the failed state across the border fared even worse. The situation in rebel-controlled northern Syria has been dire since the Assad government has not been servicing this rebel-controlled area at all. This region, with a majority population of Kurds, was already rubbled by ongoing civil war since 2011 and dependent on humanitarian aid. In the aftermath of this massive earthquake, the delivery of aid across the border was disrupted. It took over a week for the first international aid convoy to reach Syrian survivors across the border from Turkey. Meanwhile, there were reports of Syrian families on the Turkish side who were expelled from shelters because they weren't Turkish. So this cross-border disaster actually shows both the deadly effects of restrictions imposed by nation-state borders and also the urgent need for effective care and governance by the state. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around what appears to be a paradox. So the date for the election in Turkey was set today, or May 14. So we'll see whether it will bring change. But meanwhile, there is no end in sight to other disastrous wars, like in Ukraine, where an escalation of an inescapable arms race is at work, no end to death, destruction, and displacement, and no end to images of suffering on our screens. So what can be done? In our engagement in the arts and the humanities, as well as human rights claims, all this tends to be based on the conviction that there is a self with unique individual subjectivity and experience based on memory, perspective, and creative expression. Hence, the predominant mode of presenting experiences of migration has been through individual portraits, personal narratives, often assembled as a collection of tiles. Have a few examples here, so it's, the historians at the University of Minnesota, the Immigration Stories Archive, or this is a more recent comparative perspective on New York and Berlin, reimagined belonging, or our colleagues in Berlin have recently been involved in the production of long interviews with refugees. This became a kind of archive of flight at House of World Cultures. And then this actually is probably the most interesting that comes out of UC Davis, an archive called Humanizando la Deportación, which, because it does not necessarily turn the camera on migrants, but also comes up with other kinds of approaches and visual solutions. I can't go into too much detail now, but so this is a site worth checking out. So the goal of all these online archives is to humanize, to single out, to lift individuals out of the mass, highlight their human face, show that they look us in the eye, that they have complicated experiences and stories to tell. So this focus counters other mediatized representations of migrants as perilous floods and streams, who overrun borders and disrupt order. But does this form of presentation also entail a leveling and flattening? Whom do these online archives serve? So while I do not wish to diminish any efforts at making visible, audible experiences of migration and flight, I do wonder, however, whether the presentation of migrants as individuals who tell their stories, usually in retrospect from a place of safety, or as a mass waiting at borders, in camps or detention centers, whether all these images engage in a systemic analysis of the conditions that create these pressure points, and in a reflection on our own complicity as researchers, writers, image makers, in creating the categories, the labels that shape the world we live in. And I'm thinking here, for example, also of Ai Weiwei's epic film Human Flow, which you might have seen with its alternation, interesting alternation between aerial drone footage and handheld eye-level shots on the ground, where the artist filmmaker is modeling gestures of empathy for us. So it is no coincidence in my mind that the video artist Ursula Biemann, who has done remarkable video essays and installations unpacking border regimes, transportation networks, and the microeconomies of survival en route, she did in the past present on Black Sea Files and Sahara Chronicle here at Berkeley, that she has more recently shifted her focus to a project called Becoming Earth, and collaborations such as building an indigenous university in Colombia. So there is a shift from the kind of crisis focus on borders and migration to a kind of more planetary perspective there. So as we try to think beyond the generation of immersion, empathy, and humanitarianism, underlying structures and processes come to the forefront. However, the systemic analysis and aerial drone view can also not convey the full picture. As my students remind me when we discuss this material in class, we lose interest if we do not feel a personal connection. If we are not touched, shocked, or captivated by a particular story, experience, or expression. So the only way to work on this topic seems to me to adopt an adjustable mobile lens, inspired by cinema in an expanded sense, that can reveal facets of global situations of being in and out of place that governmental perspectives deny. So drawing on moving images as an epistemic tool and a social practice of framing, staging, and interaction, rather than a representation of any given reality, might expand the frame and offer some blueprints for the future to change the ways in which policy about borders and detention, movement, and settlement social justice and rights needs to be thought and written in an interconnected world. So my emphasis on framing is one of my pet peeves. It's based on the basic realization that animates theories of visual arts. Frames delineate the viewer's perception, they have borders, while begging questions about the invisibility of anything outside their limitation. So montage and contrasted constellations bring to light the ironies and absurdities in regimes and bureaucracies in the governance of residency and mobility. So epistemologically, I'm arguing that dynamic frame adjustments and scalable readings driven by open-minded curiosity are imperative for any comprehension of border regimes, migration effects, and more broadly, life on our planet in the modern world that requires planetary as well as localized engagements. So, and the cinematographic technique of zooming in and out, scaling down and up, alternating between close textual analysis and contextualization, between micro and macro perspectives, serves as a template for aesthetic and archival practices of situated but connected knowledge production in a world that requires constant frame adjustments and new forms of collaboration. So what is needed then is a flexible and combinatory vision, a grasp of the bigger picture, as well as engagement with the particular and situated personal narratives and artificial intelligence. So attempts to present a corrective to the invisibility of lives in waste, Arendt's much quoted Scum of the Earth, which seems to be growing in numbers by the day, need to cautiously navigate the temptation of showcasing the pain of others as slum tourism or poverty porn, which merely induces spectators to wallow in pity without making them reflect on their own complicity in circuits of waste and value generation. A consideration of agency and participation in processes of mediatization enable a broader systemic understanding of mobility, injustice, embedded in environmental causes and effects, than a mere focus on the representation of migrants in moving images could yield. So to end, I'd like to shift gears somewhat and turn to literature. That might help us recapture some of the ironic spirit that we detected in the middle part of that video. And also showcase some work by our students. Ilya Troyanov, the writer who gave last year's Mosse lecture here at Berkeley, wrote a beautifully composed book on aphorisms, Nach der Flucht. Ambika translated some parts of that beautifully, and they were published in our electronic journal Transit that Elizabeth mentioned, and Elizabeth is actually the managing editor of this journal. So she has also designed a poster outside that uses some of that material. So you can go check it out. It's beautifully designed. One of the posters uses a text from this book. The after flight, yes. So he Not sure this is readable. Yeah, it is probably, yeah. So that's the opening aphorisms in this book, in Ambika's translation. It's interesting that the motto also says that, where is it? This text was inspired by the cycle of the migration series by the artist Jacob Lawrence. So we were looking at these images in class, and it's a beautiful cycle all online about the great migration from the south to the north during World War I. And what stands out as we look at the images and also at the book is the kind of abstraction, the stripping down, the sparseness of the text. And one of the aphorisms, yeah, it's very colorful, striking images. So one of the aphorisms in the book then is what I would like to end with, and this is from the not yet published part of Ambika's translation. I'll read the German while you can read the English. Der Bürgermeister träumt von einer kosmopolitischen Weltstadt, einem New York der Hanse, aber ohne Flüchtlinge. Er sehnt eine große Kirmes der Vielfalt herbei, aber ohne Menschen mit falschen Papieren. Eine Teezeremonie, kein Besäufnis. Regulierter Verkehr, keine Ekstase. Je länger das Streitgespräch andauert, desto entschiedener klammert sich der Bürgermeister an argumentatives Treibgut wie ein moralisch Ertrinkender. Ein Sprichwort aus alten Zeiten sagt: Hüte dich vor jenen, die sich das Herz im Himmel wünschen und den Arsch auf dem Kanapee. And der Bürgermeister was Olaf Scholz. He was mayor of Hamburg at the time when big protests against the G20 summit were underway. And I'm sure there was tear gas involved. He now is the Chancellor of Germany, also heavily involved in the arms race, as we know. So that's the ironic note I would like to leave you with. Thank you very much.